Texas, the Lone Star State, a place so large, so loud, and so unapologetically itself that it almost feels like its own country. And honestly, Texans would prefer it that way. But here's what most people don't know. Beneath the boots, the barbecue, and the bold attitude lies one of the most psychologically fascinating populations in the entire United States. Today, we're gonna break it all down. The pride, the aggression, the loyalty, the hidden insecurities, and yes, the controversial truths that most people are too afraid to say out loud. Stay with us, because by the end of this video, you will never look at a Texan the same way again.
Let's start with something that every psychologist who has studied Texan culture immediately notices. Texans don't just live in Texas, they are Texas. This is called identity fusion, a psychological phenomenon where a person's sense of self becomes completely merged with a group. In most states, people say, "I'm from Ohio," or "I live in Michigan." In Texas, people say, "I'm a Texan," and they mean it on a deeply personal, almost spiritual level. Studies show that Texans score higher on regional identity scales than residents of any other U.S. state. They're more likely to display their state flag, more likely to reference their state in conversation, and more likely to feel personally offended when someone criticizes Texas. But why? Psychologists point to Texas's unique history, the fact that it was once an independent republic before joining the United States. That memory, passed down through generations, created a cultural DNA of separateness and pride that simply doesn't exist anywhere else. The dark side of this? Identity fusion can lead to extreme in-group versus out-group thinking. If you're not Texan, or if you criticize Texas, you were psychologically processed as a threat, not just a person with a different opinion, a threat.
Texas consistently ranks among the top states in the U.S. for gun ownership, capital punishment, and aggressive political rhetoric. And while these are political facts, the psychology behind them is far more interesting. Research in cultural psychology describes what's known as the culture of honor, a behavioral system that originated in the American South and is strongest in Texas. In a culture of honor, a person's reputation is everything. Any perceived insult, disrespect, or challenge to status must be met with a forceful response. Not because Texans are simply angry people, but because their psychological programming tells them that backing down equals losing everything. This is why Texas has some of the most aggressive road behavior statistics in the country. This is why confrontations in Texas escalate faster than in states like Minnesota or Oregon. It's not random. It's a deeply wired psychological response. And here's the controversial part. Studies suggest that people raised in culture of honor states are statistically more likely to endorse violence as a legitimate response to disrespect, even among people who have never been in a fight in their life. The psychology is already there, waiting.
Here's where it gets complicated. Because the same people who will aggressively defend their honor are also, statistically, among the most generous and hospitable in the country. This is called the hospitality paradox, and Texas is its ultimate example. Texans will invite a stranger to dinner, help a neighbor rebuild after a storm, and give you the shirt off their back. Genuine warmth, genuine community. But the hospitality comes with invisible rules. It exists within the in-group. Once you violate the unspoken code, once you disrespect the culture, the values, or the identity, that warmth disappears instantly, and what replaces it is something very cold. Psychologists call this conditional altruism, generosity that is deeply tied to perceived group membership. You are kind to those who belong. You are hostile to those who threaten. Texas is the most extreme example of this pattern in American psychology.
Now for the part most channels skip. Let's talk about race and Texas. Texas has one of the most complex racial histories of any state in America, and that history has left measurable psychological marks on its population. Research from the University of Texas found that racial resentment scores, a psychological measure of how much a person attributes racial inequality to cultural or personal failings rather than systemic causes, are significantly higher in Texas than the national average. Texas also has a long history of school segregation that lasted well into the 1970s, and studies show that communities with longer histories of enforced segregation develop stronger implicit racial biases that persist for generations, even among people who consciously reject racist views. This doesn't make every Texan racist. That would be false and irresponsible to say. But it does mean that the psychological environment in Texas, the invisible social norms, the in-group loyalty, the culture of honor, creates conditions where racial bias is statistically more likely to go unchallenged. The data doesn't lie, and understanding it is the first step to changing it. Texas has one of the highest suicide rates among men in the United States. And very few people connect this fact to the psychological pressure of Texas masculinity. The Texan man is supposed to be strong, self-sufficient, emotionally controlled, and dominant. These aren't just cultural preferences, they are psychological expectations enforced from childhood. Boys in Texas are significantly less likely to be encouraged to express vulnerability than boys in other states. The result? A generation of men who are experts at performing strength and completely unprepared for emotional pain. Psychologists call this masculinity stress, the anxiety and psychological damage caused by the constant pressure to meet an impossible standard of toughness. In Texas, this stress is amplified by the culture of honor, by religious expectations of stoicism, and by a cultural narrative that treats asking for help as weakness. The men who built this state's identity may have also built its most silent crisis. Texas is not simple. No place with 30 million people ever is. What psychology shows us is that Texans are shaped by forces most of them have never consciously examined. A history of independence, a culture of honor, a paradox of warmth and hostility, and an identity so powerful it functions almost like a religion. Understanding these patterns doesn't mean judging the people. It means seeing them clearly. And seeing people clearly, without the myths, without the stereotypes, without the fear, is the most powerful thing psychology can do. If this video made you think differently about the people around you, share it with someone who needs to see it. And if you want to know the psychology of another state or country, drop it in the comments below. We'll see you in the next one.